Hello guys, welcome to my channel Films with Denz. Today I'll be doing a movie recap about a rich person who was kidnapped and sold into slavery. Thank you for supporting my channel by watching this video. Without further ado, let's get started. Action! The movie begins with a group of black slaves who are taught to work on a farm owned by white people. The slaves worked and lived together in a place that had been prepared for them, separated from their masters. A brief flashback. We can see that this person is our protagonist. His name is Solomon Northup. He is someone who is an upper middle class who is good at playing the violin. He also has a family, 2 children, and a wife who loves him deeply. At that time, he and his family lived in Saratoga, New York in 1841. One morning, he met a friend who introduced him to 2 people, namely Brown and Hamilton. These 2 people are looking for talented people to recruit into their company. It so happened that Solomon had a talent for playing the violin. Solomon was given a very attractive offer by both of them, so good that he could not refuse it. Finally, he took the offer and now he is in Washington working for his company. After that, he woke up from the flashback, remembering that he was still an established person. He was very angry because he had been oppressed. He was thought to be a slave because of the color of his skin. And he did not have documents to prove that he was not a slave. He was then severely whipped because he was considered disobedient as a slave. His belongings were also taken because slaves were not allowed to own anything except for the items given to him by their masters. One night, Solomon and the slaves were gathered and about to be sold. They were taken to a ship. Some of the slaves couldn't stand it anymore and planned for a mutiny. Just as one of them wanted to fight the ship's crew, the slave was immediately stabbed. In the morning, Solomon and another slave were assigned to throw the body into the river. Solomon became increasingly anxious and afraid to fight. Eventually, Solomon was sold to a white man and given the name Platt. The white man turned out to be a slave reseller. He buys slaves and sells them back to buyers at a higher price. Then, in this scenario, there is someone named William Ford, played by Benedict Cumberbatch. He was also bargaining to buy several slaves, sold by the reseller. Finally, Mr. Ford bought 2 slaves and took them to his residence. Solomon and the slaves ended up living with William Ford and working on his cotton plantation. Here, we see that Mr. Ford has 2 right-hand men, namely Tibbets and Chapin. One day, Solomon saw an opportunity to cut down trees on the other side of the swamp to be sold. He discussed it with his master, Mr. Ford, and his right-hand man, Tibbets. After hearing Solomon's proposal, Mr. Ford was convinced and gave Solomon a chance. In the end, Solomon proved that he was able to complete what he proposed and gain Mr. Ford's trust. Tibbets became envious and consumed with fear because he saw that Solomon was a smart person and could replace him as Mr. Ford's right-hand man. His position was threatened. One day, Tibbets was trying to make Solomon a scapegoat, trying to find mistakes in his assignments deliberately. Solomon defended himself and said that he was only following orders according to Tibbets' instructions. Unhappy because Solomon was disobedient, Tibbets became angry and ordered Solomon to take off his clothes so that he could be whipped. Feeling humiliated by this order, Solomon finally snapped and fought Tibbets. It turned out that Tibbets was weak and couldn't fight. In the end, Solomon won the fight. Unfortunately, when the fight was over, one of Mr. Ford's other trusted men, Chapin, came because he heard Tibbets' screams. Chapin was shocked and asked what happened. Solomon immediately explained that Tibbets was deliberately looking for trouble and wanted to find Solomon's faults so that he could be punished. Lost the fight to Solomon, Tibbets immediately ran away, seething with anger and vowed to take revenge later. Seeing this, Chapin immediately told Solomon to calm down and not run away from the plantation, because if he ran away, he would be seen as a guilty person and Chapin would not be able to protect him. Solomon waited and waited. He could only hope for the best. But from a distance, Tibeats came with two of his friends and wanted to immediately kill Solomon by hanging. Thankfully, Chapin soon arrives, warning Tibeats and his friends that anyone who touches Solomon will die, because Solomon is Mr. Ford's slave and Tibeats does not have the right to kill Solomon, because Solomon is not his property. After that, Solomon was left hanging, literally, until his master, Mr. Ford, arrived. Seeing Solomon experiencing such brutal treatment, several other slaves also gave assistance to him, such as giving him drinking water, but not more than that, because Chapin was watching until finally Mr. Ford came and cut the rope that was holding him. Solomon was taken home to rest for a while, but seeing the potential for Tibeats to come back and take revenge, Solomon's ownership was sold to someone named Edwin Epps. Edwin Epps was a master, famous for his brutal treatment of slaves. In fact, he was known as the Slave Destroyer. One evening, Mr. Epps held a dance party for the slaves because he found it amusing to see them dancing. But suddenly, Mr. Epps' wife took a glass bottle and threw it at a female slave named Patsy, and immediately asked Mr. Epps to sell her. But Mr. Epps didn't want to, because Patsy was an accomplished slave and did a very good job at his plantation. Not afraid of his wife's threats, Mr. Epps said he will leave her if she continues this, and saying that he was not afraid of her. After that, his wife left, and Mr. Epps ordered the slaves to dance again and entertain him for the night. One day, Solomon was asked by Mr. Epps to take Patsy home from Mr. Shaw's residence. There he saw Patsy was drinking tea with Mrs. Shaw, also a black woman, surprisingly. Solomon told Patsy to go home because Mr. Epps requested her presence, but Patsy refused and said that it was the day of Sabbath, so she should be allowed to go anywhere she wanted. Mrs. Shaw told Solomon to sit down for a while and have a chat with her. At first, Solomon did not dare and was reluctant, but because he was constantly persuaded, he finally complied with Mrs. Shaw's request. After chatting for a while, it turns out that Mrs. Shaw was also a slave, but because Mr. Shaw loved her, she was made to be his lover. She also told Patsy to stay with Mr. Epps and stay on his good side, so that she can be made as his lover and have a better life. When Solomon and Patsy returned to Mr. Epps' residence, Mr. Epps suspiciously asked Solomon what they had discussed at Mr. Shaw's residence. Solomon said that they were just chatting and not talking about anything strange. Mr. Epps, in his drunken state, became increasingly suspicious and said that Solomon was lying, forced him to tell the truth. But Solomon did not lie and was indeed telling the truth. Mr. Epps became angry and took out a knife from his trousers, chased Solomon. There was a small chase at Mr. Epps' farm. Mr. Epps fell in the animal barn and slipped when trying to climb out the fence. Finally, they reconciled after Mrs. Epps came out of the house and saw their childish debacle. One night, Mr. Epps came into the slave's room and asked Patsy to come out. It turns out that Patsy was asked to have sex with Mr. Epps. As a slave, she had no other choice, because if she did not obey, she could lose her life. After that, Patsy was left alone outside of Mr. Epps' residence, helpless in the dark of night. One morning, Mr. Epps discovered that his cotton fields had been hit by a pest outbreak. Almost all of his cotton plantations died due to attacks by cotton worms. He immediately took his slaves to Mr. Shaw's residence to help Mr. Shaw and Judge Turner in their sugarcane plantation. We now return to the initial scenario when Solomon was already a slave, where he was taught to harvest sugarcane and collect it in a cart. Solomon was asked by Judge Turner whether he was good at playing the violin. He said yes, so he was given the opportunity to show off his skills at a party for Willard Yarner, a slave owner who also owned a land near the swamp. He was also allowed to keep the money he earned from this job. Some time had passed and the slaves returned to Mr. Epps's residence. Because the pest outbreak had been dealt with, Mr. Epps also appears to have a daughter who was black-skinned, possibly the child of Mr. Epps and Patsy. Returning to Mr. Epps' cotton plantation, it turns out there was a white man who became a cotton picker named Armsby. He was a supervisor at one plantation. However, he was addicted to alcohol, so he could not be trusted to work on the plantation as a supervisor anymore. That's why he was demoted from his position and became an ordinary cotton picker like the other black slaves. One night, Solomon asked Armsby for help. Solomon promised to give all his earnings to Armsby if he promised to help Solomon. Solomon only asked Armsby to send a letter to the post office in Marksville and not to tell anyone about it. Seeing Solomon's sincerity, Armsby agreed to Solomon's request and accepted any payment sincerely. Armsby told Solomon to write the letter and meet him in 2 days. Unbeknownst to Solomon, it turns out that Armsby had betrayed Solomon and told Mr. Epps all of his plans. Solomon still tried to deny it when questioned by Mr. Epps. He said, how could he write a letter without ink and paper? And to whom would he write the letter to? He doesn't even have family or acquaintances. Solomon tried to shift the suspicion onto Armsby by saying that Armsby was a liar and a drunkard, so his words could not be trusted. With his desperate cunningness, Solomon managed to trick Mr. Epps and convinced him that Armsby was the one who made up the untrue story to gain Mr. Epps's trust so that he would gain his position back as the plantation's supervisor. After that, Solomon rushed to take the letter he had written and immediately burned it so that no one would find any evidence. One afternoon, at Mr. Epps's residence, a group of builders were seen working to build a house on Mr. Epps's land. One of the handyman's name is Bass, played by Brad Pitt. Bass argued with Mr. Epps that black people are humans too, and although they are owned by Mr. Epps and have a different skin color, they are also people in the eyes of the Almighty. Mr. Epps was offended. He felt that he was being compared to a baboon because he said comparing white people and black people was like comparing humans to baboons. But Bess says that this is wrong thinking. One day, the rules and laws will change, and one day these black people will be considered human beings on the same level as white people and no longer considered objects that can be bought or sold. Returning to Mr. Epps' residence, Mr. Epps anxiously and angrily asked the other female slaves where Patsy was. But the slaves didn't know where Patsy had gone. Seeing Patsy return to Mr. Epps' residence, Mr. Epps quickly intercepted her and angrily accused her of wanting to run away. But Patsy said that she only went to Mr. Shaw's residence to ask Mrs. Shaw for some soap, because Mr. Epps' wife hates Patsy, so Patsy couldn't clean herself properly without soap. Mr. Shaw, full of suspicion, says Patsy is lying and immediately punishes her. Patsy was stripped naked and tied to a wooden pole. At first, Mr. Epps wanted to whip Patsy himself, but because he couldn't bear it, Mr. Epps ordered Solomon to lash Patsy. After that, Patsy was released from the pole and had her wounds treated by the other slaves. Some other time, we see Solomon was helping Bass, who is building a house for Mr. Epps. After chatting for a while, Bass said that Solomon had quite a lot of traveling experience for a slave. Solomon told Bass that he was not actually a slave, but because he was kidnapped and nobody trusted him, he actually became a slave for many years. Solomon asked Bass for help so that he wrote letters to Solomon's friends who lived in the north and told them about the situation that Solomon was experiencing now, so that they could issue letters to free Solomon from slavery. Even though he was afraid of violating the law, Bass agreed to help Solomon to write a letter and send it to his friends. One day, when Solomon was plowing the fields, suddenly a proper-looking gentleman came and looking for a slave named Platt. Solomon approached the person and saw his friend, Mr. Parker, was standing in front of Mr. Epps's house. The man then asked Solomon if he had another name. Solomon finally admitted that his name was Solomon Northup and not Platt. It turns out that this well-dressed person was a sheriff, and the sheriff was confirming whether this person named Platt is actually Solomon. The sheriff also asked other things, such as whether he had a family, what his children's names were, and what his wife's name was before she was married to Solomon. Unhappy with this situation, Mr. Epps immediately ordered Solomon to return to the fields because Solomon belonged to him. However, Solomon's friend, Mr. Parker, immediately defended him and said that he was not Platt, but his name is Solomon Northup, and he is definitely not a slave. Mr. Parker and Mr. Epps quarreled so much that they said they would take this matter to the court to resolve it. Solomon hugged Patsy goodbye and climbed into the horse-drawn carriage with Mr. Parker and the sheriff. Finally, Solomon returned home and immediately met his entire family. He was finally able to rejoin his aging wife, his daughter Margaret, who already had her own family, his grown son Alonzo. And with that, the film was finished. Solomon Northup was one of the few victims of kidnapping to regain freedom from slavery. Solomon brought the men responsible for his abduction to trial. Unable to testify against whites in the nation's capital, he lost the case against the slave pen owner James Birch. After lengthy legal proceedings in New York, his kidnappers, Hamilton and Brown, also avoided prosecution. In 1853, Solomon published the book 12 Years a Slave. He became active in the abolitionist movement, lectured on slavery throughout the northeastern United States, and aided fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. The date, location, and circumstances of Solomon's deaths are unknown.